I want to thank you today for braving the traffic. And I know you could have been at the state dinner, but you chose us instead. And we're grateful for it. I'm Glenn Tiffert. I'm a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. I co-chair our project on China's global sharp power, which is kind of the Hoover Institution's hub for work on China. We have three main lines of effort. One of those is tracking China's progress in critical technologies, of which sort of data kind of falls into that bucket. The next is protecting our research enterprise by working on research security and integrity. That's the work our universities, our national labs, our startup ecosystems do in critical technologies again, ensuring that we can stay open and collaborative, but do it safely and wisely. And then the third line of effort has to do with malign foreign influence, not only within the United States, but also among U.S. allies, partners, and parts of the world that we have strong interests in. And so it became clear to us not long ago that data was an important issue that was worth looking into. ZTE, Huawei, Alibaba, BGI, Too Simple, TikTok. Over the last several years, a parade of PRC firms has burst into our consciousness, belatedly as embodiments of the risk that engaging with firms in authoritarian countries, particularly Leninist, highly disciplined authoritarian countries that have ambitions and aspirations to comprehensive national power pose. And our tendency has been to take each one in turn separately without following them back to the logic or connective tissue that underlines, that binds them together. A year ago, in partnership with the Asia Society, and today we're joined by Orville Schell, director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at the Asia Society. In partnership with the Asia Society, we approached Matt Johnson to pull on those threads and follow where they lead. So today he'll share with you his extraordinary findings and engage with an equally extraordinary panel of experts to reflect on his report and their sense of the subject. Just to give you a preview of what we have coming up shortly beyond that, we have a report on semiconductors coming out in about a month from the Hoover Institution called the Silicon Triangle that looks at the Taiwan-China-U.S. relationship in this highly strategic area. And that will be working on a report on the regulation of private enterprise in the PRC, which is an increasingly important topic. But over to Matt. Matt is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and research director at Garneau Global. His expertise covers China's contemporary elite politics, strategic thinking, and political control over the financial sector and private economy. He was previously a lecturer in the history and politics of modern China at the University of Oxford in the UK, and a researcher with the China's War with Japan program. His academic publications have focused on propaganda, Chinese Communist Party ideology, cultural security, state-society relations, and the Cold War. But now he's in industry. We're joined by Grady McGregor, who's a staff writer for The Wire China, based in Washington. He was previously a staff writer at Fortune magazine in Hong Kong, writing features on business, tech, and things related to China. Before that, he had stints as a journalist and editor in Jordan, Lebanon, and North Dakota, exotically. He's a Minnesota native that grew up in Beijing and earned his bachelor's from Wesleyan University. Next to Grady is Susan Aaronson, who teaches and writes about data, AI, digital trade, human rights, and data governance. She directs the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub at GW, which maps the governance of public, private, and proprietary data for 68 countries and the EU at the national and international levels. And she's written 5 books on trade and 1 on global corporate social responsibility. And of course, I've already mentioned Orville Schell, who's a longtime writer and scholar who's focused on modern China and Chinese issues for quite some time. The former dean at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley, he's currently vice president of the Asia Society in New York, and he's also Arthur Ross director of the Center of U.S. China Relations. Matt will present the findings of his report. We'll have a discussion from the panelists, and then we'll close out with Q&A from the audience. So Matt, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks to Hoover and thanks to the Asia Society for supporting this research. Thanks to all of you for coming today. Thanks to my co-panelists for having read the report and been thoughtful in their responses to it. Really pleased to be able to share it more widely with this great group. The main finding is that the United States and China are engaged in a global competition for control of the distribution and storage of the world's data, whether acknowledged or not. So I'm primarily a China scholar by background. My perspective on this comes from having read fairly deeply in the speeches and other writings of Xi Jinping, in the policies, laws, and economic development frameworks that have been issued by China's party state, and by fairly granular research on the behavior of Chinese companies, both in China and abroad, in this case, with respect to data. And what I did in the report was try to put all of these perspectives together in a fairly forensic and connected way. I think in the context of this competition, one of the best guides is to understand, what the strategic thinking and the strategic behavior looks like from the perspective of, to be open, the competitor. And so I think that as the report kind of begins, it is a competition because China's leader, Xi Jinping, treats the control of data as a kind of, key, almost like a master key to cementing China's position globally in the economy and to becoming a more powerful strategic actor on the world stage. So there are a couple of key statements that the report begins with, which I found quite striking in my own research. When Xi Jinping came into power in 2013, he basically said that whoever controlled data and big data was going to control or at least be able to shape the future course of development. And then a year later, he talked about the importance of data as an economic commodity that China, again, had to sort of acquire as much of in order to become a more powerful country. And in 2016, as his agenda deepened, he began to speak more clearly about the integration of digital technologies, both inside of China and then outside of China as well, kind of forming an interconnected whole. And as far as I can tell, I mean, it's in the report as speeches that he's given, statements that the party has made about why big data is important for its economic development policies, for its strategic priorities. The goal really is to absorb at global scale as much of the world's data as possible. The same way that, for example, controlling oil as a strategic resource or access to oil is important for nation states. Data is like the new oil in Xi's view, and as a strategic priority for China, it sort of has that bedrock significance. So these would just be words, except China's system as a Leninist system, is highly centralized. The orders from the top cascade down through the other parts of the system, and this can also be observed. So as Xi has developed his thinking around big data, China and in other words, specifically the party and its organs and the state and its organs began to develop new policies for big data use, for big data infrastructure, for cybersecurity and remote sensing, both inside of China and outside of China, and around encryption and data security, meaning basically that the party states' sort of rights to view data of PRC citizens and other entities have been formalized and increased, and that also goes for companies that are operating within China. And at the same time, the protections around data coming from China and its transferability overseas have also increased. So from an economic perspective, this is almost like a mercantilist posture. And again, from a national security perspective, the goal is to strengthen China and China's ability to see, control, use, et cetera, data, whether it's the military, the party state, other entities. That's the basic frame. And so the report goes into this in some detail, I would say. One of the key findings from an institutional and organizational perspective, which was of great interest to me, is over time, she has built a kind of flywheel for a lot of this activity, which is what is now the party's Central Cybersecurity and Informationization Commission, which is, the real power behind what most people know as the Cyberspace Administration of China. And it's this body that has shaped a lot of the laws, a lot of the policies and frameworks around big data. And those policies and frameworks really emphasize, pretty much from the inception, the kind of combination of state and private or market and military, actors and interests that are all involved in China's data policy. So in other words, being able to acquire data commercially, say, and share it with the military is part of this data strategy and agenda. Cascading further down the state system, in 2015, 2016, and 2021, the Chinese state has issued a series of big data industry development plans that focus on building infrastructure within China for the storage and processing of data, developing the software needed to, read and make use of data, and also to acquire data abroad through commercial channels in ways that sort of accelerate the acquisition of data by Chinese state and military, I think we have to say, entities. The report goes into case studies, I think, from a risk perspective and from a sort of highlighting party ties to commercial actors perspective. There are several sectors that are note. One is pharmaceuticals and genomics. And so the report talks at some level of detail about companies like Wuxi AppTech and BGI, and their ties both to Beijing and the sort of inroads that they've made into industries in the United States and elsewhere that would potentially put, say, like personal, medical, and genetic data into this system that I've described. In the social media space, there's obviously the pretty glaring example of TikTok. I was a co-author on a submission to the Australian Parliament on TikTok and its ties to China's party state. That includes ByteDance. They're visible. They can be identified. And then in the drone sector as well, companies like DJI and Autel, which are widely used, by, say, law enforcement agencies here within the U.S. and used in ways that pose data risks because the technology itself, the software, the way that it's configured, its components, I would say are not necessarily vetted and tested in the same way that the U.S. government ended up testing components by Huawei and ZTE, which ultimately resulted in their expulsion from U.S. telecom systems. I think similar evidence exists in areas like crypto and financial technology, in areas like autonomous vehicles, particularly autonomous trucking, but the report doesn't go into those case studies at the same level of detail. In any event, the basic picture, which I think is important to keep in mind, for those of you who have a comparative politics background, Glenn told me here, but China's party state is still Leninist in terms of its organizational structure, which means that, it distinctions between public and private, between state and corporate, don't exist in a sort of fundamental organizational sense, don't exist. And I think that's important to keep in mind when talking about China. I'm not saying that China doesn't have like laws for corporations or, laws that detail the rights and responsibilities of citizens, but I'm saying that they either exist in tension with or are superseded by other laws that demand specific kinds of behavior and compliance from individuals and organizations. And I think also important to keep in mind is that China's Communist Party has a very particular history, which is that, during its early decades, it was an underground organization that had to operate around laws and around, the sort of legal political sphere that existed, within China during the first half of the 20th century. So in other words, from an organizational perspective, the party has always been very good. And, Xi himself boasts about this, calls, these features of the party, its organizational advantages. But the party has been very good at, sort of connecting its different parts in ways that allow it to, carefully and slowly and often in very opaque ways achieve political objectives. And so when you put these two things together, the fact that, we have corporations that are complex entities already, and then on top of that, they have internal structures of party governance. And then finally, they operate in jurisdictions outside of China, which are not used to dealing with all of these features of organizations that I've just mentioned. That adds up to a fairly significant national security risk if the country, that is directing the behavior of these organizations is also a country that, in the case of the United States government, is identified as, the greatest strategic competitor out there. And so that may be the broader finding of the report, is that data is one kind of case study, but really what we're talking about applies in, any sphere. And I'm a researcher. It's hard to convince people that the answer to everything is to do more research. But I think that actually is, one of the first recommendations that I would make is that, transparency around all of these issues be increased, through more research and knowledge and information. Now, there were other recommendations as well, which I will talk about very briefly. I think there is legislative and executive momentum in some of the areas that I've mentioned. And so the recommendations of the report basically, in a sense, call for strengthening that momentum in areas like, listing, naming, in other words, Chinese companies that, fall foul of U.S. Data laws if they existed in stronger form, which they really don't. And, making it more difficult for those, companies to transact outside of China's borders, or at least within U.S. borders. Being clear when data is being exposed and who it's being exposed to would, I think, be one way of beginning to address this broader set of risks and issues. Using the model of the Commerce Department's ICTS process, which I think was integral to understanding, why Huawei and CTE ultimately were deemed companies that could, operate in the United States in a way that was compatible with national security interests, and broadening, that process and its application to other sectors that are also, like telecommunications, critical. I think CFIUS and the review of foreign investment into the country is important. I think, based on conversations that I've had, some of the criticisms of the CFIUS process are that, it could be faster, and it could be, I think, a little more deliberate about, saying simply that this company does not seem likely to meet any, sort of real national security thresholds, and so therefore the answer is no, not sort of, writing a letter and reviewing. I'm not trying to stereotype or mischaracterize it. I'm simply saying that it may be that the scope and scale and pace, so to speak, of the problem is greater than our current review processes allow for. And, that also turns on something that I think, people, colleagues, officials, others who are in that space would agree with, which is that more capacity is needed in order to understand more about, companies that operate in the United States or that seek to invest into the United States. So there were a few others, but we're at time, and I think that want to hear thoughts as well. So thanks very much.
For those of you who were not able to get a paper copy of the report, it's freely downloadable from Hoover's website, which is hoover.org/CGSB for China's Global Sharp Power. You can find all of our reports there, and MAPS is certainly one of them, and his next report will be as well. But now I'd like to turn the floor over to our panelists, and we'll start with Orville Schell for reflections.
Well, congratulations. I have to say, I'm glad you're doing your research, because for many of us, reading the writings of Xi Jinping for a new era with Chinese characteristics is a bit like eating toxic sludge. But someone has to do it, because everything is spelled out there very clearly. And I think that what was so interesting for me about what you did in this exegesis on data is you suggested the grand scope of Xi Jinping's intentions to rejuvenate China. This is just one piece, but in this piece we see the whole. We see the tenacity, we see thoroughness, discipline, we see the grand pretension of this man. And it's quite impressive. And I think it bespeaks of China's sort of national impulse to this idea of wealth and power, rejuvenation, the China dream, et cetera, et cetera. And it is not to be trifled with. I've seen nothing like it, even though I went to China when Mao Zedong was still alive and the Cultural Revolution was still going on. This is an impressive effort. And it's an effort that we do need to come to terms with, to reckon with, to assess adequate properly. And we need to engender our own proper responses to it. Xi Jinping said, north, south, east, and west, the party is central. And that's true. And it is central not only in the life of China, but China's life in the world. And you documented that very well. I think, too. And it's important for us to sort of recognize the scope of what it is that Xi Jinping would like to accomplish. And you got it very well.
Yeah, and I want to echo Orville's remarks and just you so methodically laid out this case. And I'm a business journalist, so what really stuck out to me was the degree to which corporate structures are so important to this argument. I think you said at one point it was maybe the most important building blocks of party data strategy are corporations. And I just think that has a lot of sort of troubling implications for any sort of business that's doing, Chinese business working in the US, any US business working in China. You went through examples like BGI with drones as well, but it's come up in virtually every story that I've reported recently, whether that's Cat Vision to if Chinese firms are trying to tap into Texas electrical grid. And so, so reflecting on it, I'm just, what is are we headed towards a sort of data decoupling with those corporations? And, we see that with something like Huawei, like ByteDance, maybe those risks are very sort of front of mind, but I'm curious, when companies are trying to partner to fight cancer or climate change, what are we losing as well? And so just sort of trying to grapple with some of those implications. And then I guess my final point is I was recently reporting on this National Data Bureau that China kind of created to sort of try to harness data for their own uses. And you lay out very sort of methodically this case that, this data strategy from the top levels of the government. But I'm curious to what degree, the CCP is very aspirational. How is that being executed? They're creating this sort of National Data Bureau in part because a lot of these, like even within provinces, across companies, it's unclear to me the degree to which they're talking to each other. I think last year there was this big data breach in Shanghai with a bunch of police records. And so, these data systems aren't perfect. So I am kind of curious also the degree to which these policies are being effectively implemented. But yeah, again, I just really want to applaud you on this report. And it's really interesting things to think about as I try to cover these companies you talk about.
Susan, please.
Okay, thanks. Nice to meet you all. I am going to rain on this parade, and I apologize for that. First of all, I want to agree with what everyone said, which is this is an important piece of research, and I recommend that you read it. But I found it utterly unconvincing for 3 reasons. Basically, based on my own recent review of China's use of data governance and policies to stimulate XR. And I would say if there's any nation that actually has there are 2 that actually think very coherently about data, I would say it's the EU and South Korea. And if you want evidence of plans and strategies that turn into actual policies, regulations, and incentives, it's South Korea. So we can talk about that later. So there's a couple of things that I found troubling. But I also, again, I want to be a nice person and say it in a nice way. But first of all, data is not like any other good service because it is simultaneously a good and a service. That's thing one. Thing two, it is an inexhaustible resource. It's not an exhaustible resource like oil. To compare it to that is troubling. It is simultaneously something, so I'm not going to say good or service, that can be reused until your grandchildren are around, if not beyond that, right? You and I don't know the uses. It can be a commercial asset, a global public good, right, to solve wicked problems like how do diseases spread. So to think about data as this one thing is troubling to me. There are 3 main types of data: personal, public. There's also open data, which can be a mix, but public is data paid for or controlled by governments or research or collected by governments. And then proprietary data, right? Intellectual property, trade secrets, algorithms are an example of that. Okay, so my first concern is that when I read English translation out of the China, all of China's various data strategies and strategies related to data-driven sectors, I do not see an effective translation of those strategies into policies. You do see very good AI regulation, which is why people are paying so much attention to China's AI regulations. But you also see nuttiness on the part of China regarding asking foreign companies to share various types of proprietary or, almost all of it is proprietary data, which also maybe include personal data with the government. So that's one point. The next point I'd like to make is that the United States needs China to keep us on our toes. I am grateful that TikTok is a threat to Facebook, and because I want to see Facebook do better. I want Facebook to succeed. And I think Facebook has become fat and lazy, and it's learning from TikTok, just as it's learning because it sort of missed the generative AI window. I think in the same way, China understands that it's got to make choices related to its data. And I just want to give you one example, right? So I do a lot of work on AI because I work for NSF Trustworthy AI Institute, where I'm co-PI. And in that work, we look at why do firms choose to make some algorithms open source and others use trade secrets to protect their algorithms, right? And China's are almost all open source. So that's interesting, right? that they're willing to share the code with everybody in the view that that code would be better if they get lots of comments on it. Okay, so that's thing one. But the other side of it is China's data is protected by the Great Firewall. They do not have free flow of data, and they probably won't unless the polity changes. And that has made their generative AI weaker. Why? Because there's a lot of data that is scraped around the world that goes into large learning models that they can't include in their generative AI because they censor it, right? So they're paying a price for that because they won't have good generative AI as a result of that. And I think those distinctions are important. China has to learn. It needs that feedback loop to do a good job on data-driven technologies such as AI. And so while I think the author's analysis is thoughtful, well-researched and sourced, and I want to repeat those things, this is a really well-sourced paper. I just disagree totally with the conclusion and the recommendations. In my mind, the United States would be so much better off if China had its act together on data. And not, saying because China understands that data is a national security asset. I think China does not yet really understand the potential of data to help solve some of its many problems, from the bubbles that it seems to constantly experience in real estate and finance to, how do you find jobs for all these highly skilled college graduates that are underemployed today? There's been a study that you might want to look at by Thomas Streinz, and it looks at the influence of China in global data governance. I think it came out last year, but basically they examined every country where there was Belt and Road and whether or not China tried to influence that country's data governance and internet governance policies, and they found none, basically. So it's worth looking at that. I also feel like the United States, we have so much benefited from an open approach to data, yet we really do not understand data at all. We don't understand that public good nature, that it is a global public good versus the commercial nature of data. We do understand the distinction between public, personal, and proprietary data. But, we have not gotten our act together on these things. And I'm not hopeful that we will. So I am worried about ideas that make us more like China. I think we have to be more like the U.S., which means that we understand openness, whether it's open immigration, open ideas, open source models, and we should welcome that. Sorry. Thanks for hearing me out.
Yeah, sure. I want to give Matt an opportunity to respond to everyone's remarks. Yeah.
Well, look, as Glenn mentioned, I'm formerly an academic, and I have done presentation and critique, and then now I am at the stage, of the process where I want to respectfully acknowledge, but not honestly close off time for questions by going into a lengthy response here. I would just say, one, I identify fully with the concern that somehow, a more kind of suspicious atmosphere might make certain kinds of human benefiting research and cooperation possible. That is a concern that I certainly share and should be highlighted. So, nothing that we're talking about here is easy. It's obviously going to require certain trade-offs, and the other would be with respect to openness and free and open societies, bedrock ideals of this country. Why tamper with that in a way that would potentially sounds like I would be advocating setting off on some other trajectory, which I certainly don't. At the same time, the evidence that I found is also concerning. And I think that it is concerning because what it basically says, and maybe you have to read a lot of science fiction to get this, but What I think it basically says is that it's not unusual for Leninist systems either. Xi Jinping's vision, the vision of China, is a sort of cybernetic vision of a world that is, in fact, increasingly interconnected, but it is increasingly connected and controllable. And the more levers of control that China has in that interconnected, controllable world, the better for China, and that they can be wielded strategically in order to advance China's interests abroad. We already know that China uses mechanisms of economic coercion and trade to punish countries with which it's displeased, its leaders are displeased. I think we know now that China is working together with Russia to reshape the world order, in a way that reflects, what leaders of those countries, say they see as an inevitable historical tendency toward multipolarity that is going to break the unipolarity of the current system to the extent that it remains. And those are two agendas that China's current leadership has already begun to implement. One is economic coercion, making the world more economically dependent on China and wielding that dependency in order to, affect outcomes in China's national, shift outcomes toward the sort of China's national interest side of the balance sheet. And then also working together with Russia to reshape global security architecture and norms. And so to the extent that data is part of this equation as well, and I think that what I've established here is that Xi Jinping sees that it is, and the rest of the party has fallen into line, the mechanisms of state and government, et cetera, have fallen into line. That needs to be sort of viewed through a similar sense of how China defines and will pursue strategic objectives. So what are the risks in this more interconnected, controllable world? One is that, key parts of U.S. infrastructure that are produced by or otherwise controlled by it. I'll get into what I mean by that. China could potentially be altered, influenced, shut off in the event of a conflict with the United States. This issue appeared recently in the case of cranes that are used to move goods through U.S. ports. We could also apply that same logic to drones, to autonomous vehicles, to key parts of the grid, the electrical, the energy grid, to key parts of our emerging new energy vehicle sectors where the batteries are, increasingly, that subsector is China dominated, basically. This is getting a little bit of the field from data, but what I'm saying is anything that can be used for leverage in an increasingly competitive world that China is actively seeking to reshape is full stop going to be used for leverage. And what I see is, I also used to work more on propaganda, and like data, propaganda is one of those sort of like ineffable, how does it really work? How does it change our world? Obviously the same can be said about data, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't ask the question about how it is that more information and more controllability in the hands of competitor countries can reshape outcomes in a way that disadvantages openness and cooperation and all of the other ideals that we care about.
Can I just say one thing on that, though?
Sure.
It reminds me of the debtor-creditor relationship in a sense, because, you see all these companies pushing back against China and leaving China at a time when China needs foreign investment because the pandemic recovery didn't happen. So, it is that catch-22, right?
Yeah, so there is a tightrope that leaders in Beijing have to walk also, which is, wanting more strategic autonomy and at the same time, feeling like the time is not yet, right to say we're not interested in, foreign investment in critical sectors or in, foreign MNCs coming in and manufacturing those sectors. That's absolutely true. But I don't see it as a deterrent to, coercive strategic behavior. It's a tightrope.
Horrible. Because I have to run to the airport I want to make one last comment. I think one of the most important things for us to do is to recognize that we are in a process here. It's moving very rapid, and the situation is changing constantly. And that requires us, because we have such different political systems. This is where ideology, Chinese words, they don't get ideological, it's like getting into a Cold War, but I'm sorry to tell you that ideology does matter. Systems do matter. And they matter because as they conflict and become more powerful and more contentious, threat levels rise. And that's precisely what's happening. The data, which seemed this innocuous, kind of bland, lingua franca, common currency, suddenly acquires a very different cast. Because it can be used as you said, to manipulate, punish, and to control. And if there's one thing Xi Jinping, it seems to me, is about, it is control. And this is his sort of Leninist background. This came of age in the Cultural Revolution. I think this is how England navigate the world. And so I think it's really important in not just this realm, but every realm in which we interact with China, whether it's the just commerce, buying, bamboo furniture, whatever, to understand that this whole interaction has become irradiated by an increased sense of threat that has to do with China's global tensions, control systems, and indeed, as Eugene said, sector. So just putting this in the larger political context, Glenn, you will forgive me if I take my lead.
Thank you very much, Orville, for joining us. Let's give him a round. So I'd like to spend a few minutes in conversation with the panelists, and then happy to take some questions. But let me start by posing, I think, a big picture question that all of you have touched on, and that is this question of openness. For most of our systems and our touch points with China, openness arises as a question, as a challenge in one way or another. And it is largely, the question is, how can systems which are liberal, democratic, have functioning civil societies, are premised on varying degrees of openness, whether we're talking about Europe or the United States or Japan, Australia, Korea. These are democratic nations. Openness is integral to democracies. It is our operating system in a sense, right? And even so, on data, we have issues with Europe and the United States regarding regulation and exchange of data. But at least we have sort of similar languages and frameworks and underlying principles. China, though, is coming from a completely different place, a very different operating system. Leninist systems, the Chinese Party state, just like the Soviet state before it, and its neighbor, North Korea, are not premised on openness. These are not principles that they share. And so the disconnect, the cognitive dissonance between a world that is committed to openness in principle and one that's committed to control, and information control in particular, because information is power in a very palpable sense for the party. How do we manage that incompatibility? Because openness with regard to a system that weaponizes information feels like unilateral disarmament. So I want to pose that to all three of you and get your reaction.
Well, it's interesting you would say that, because in AI, there's this huge debate now, because, as you know, in the United States, science is supposed to be replicated, or in Western countries, right? Which means the data has to be open, and if you have a federally funded project, directly or indirectly, your data has to be made available, made secure in a certain way, and tested by others, right? And China buys into that, though, too. So, but today, because of generative AI, which is based on large language models, which are web scraped, which should appall all of us, because you and I we gave not one whit of our consent to that use, right? And proprietary systems are also essentially did not give their permission. I don't know if you all saw the Washington Post did an analysis of this, but the bottom line point is many scientists are terrified of this because they feel that their data is being taken without their consent and portrayed in certain ways through the large learning models in ways that may be incorrect, and they can't correct it. So this is a constant debate in the West. I think it's a newer debate in China. But there is this weird dichotomy in China. And as a non-China expert, I don't know what to make of it. So, for example, during the Trump administration, right, before the pandemic, universities really started to suffer. And then the pandemic, of course, made it worse. Because most universities have tons of Chinese students. And not just Chinese students, right? Students from Lebanon, El Salvador, and Greece, right? And we live on that because they keep our students on their toes and vice versa. Just as I want students from North Dakota and Mexico, etc., right? And so you want that mix because you need that competition, you need that debate, you need that openness. So the weird thing about China is they're a part of it in terms of science, and they're a part of it in terms of travel. Like, who hasn't been to, like Switzerland or Paris and been shocked at all, not since the pandemic, but how many Chinese people are traveling, which is a form of openness. So China is essentially saying, we're okay with our people either studying in, at Oxford or Stanford, and we're okay with them traveling to Washington, D.C. What's up with that? And then they do horrible things to Australians related to information control regarding that soldier who was just the soldier in Afghanistan who was accused of torture, and they kept beating the Australians about this, and eventually he was found guilty of it. But get my point here? Is that clear? It's this weird dichotomy in China. So I feel like they're evolving in some ways. They're just not there yet. I agree with you. China has never been the country, unless somehow Communist Party is no longer in charge, that, that is open, fully open and accepts free debate. But there is some openness. And they do accept public comments on regulations, and they are responsive in some ways. Well, how do we explain that? Is it evolving over time? Is it because of their religion? Is it, I'm not sure I would put it on Marxist-Leninist system.
Yeah, well, I think that the question of openness is so interesting, and I feel like China's very good at sort of taking advantage of Western openness. I was raised in sort of Beijing when you could, an Indiana Jones movie came out Thursday. By Friday, you could be watching a pirated DVD of it. And so that is clearly still playing out today. And the sophisticated systems of being able to, as you document, sort of take advantage of data openness is really interesting. Something Susan said earlier was really interesting as well, just in terms of how much China's own maybe paranoia, if that's the wrong word, around this issue is also hamstringing it. If you think about, in terms of maybe generative AI, I can think of other examples like maybe the stalled DD IPO if there's, hamstringing their own sort of economic growth. I've been tracking a case of there's a scientist who was trying to work on both sides of the U.S. China border, but was accused of smuggling out blood samples and, therefore leaking Chinese genetic data when he was a sort of innovative biotech founder. And I'm just, to what degree is maybe China's lack of openness maybe also holding it back? That makes sense.
You have thoughts, Matt, on that?
On openness generally?
Yeah.
On
Up or down?
Yeah. Thumbs up. You all just heard my points for the most part, so I don't have too much more to add. I think I would just say basically it would be good if more of those, examples of cooperation and, transparency and mutual trust existed. And I think, I share Orville's sense that under Xi Jinping, China is just moving in a different trajectory right now. So I still think you can find those examples, but I think they are fewer and fewer, and a lot of the participation in, like international fora and international research, et cetera, is being instrumentalized in ways that are ultimately, about commercial advantage and strategic advantage. And that's a real danger there. You can have what, in a kind of local and short-term sense feels like, good, solid collaboration. But the problem is that trust levels are low. The acuity of the competition is high. And so it just means that, I think a lot of those, more sort of human to human kind of experiences are, one, they're sort of shrinking in terms of scale and frequency, and two, they're being instrumentalized in ways that I think the participants themselves might, object to, but may not really have a choice.
Yeah, I really like the terminology you came up with, because China isn't adhering to internationally accepted norms of cyber behavior. And you came up with this term, accumulation espionage system, which I really like, because that's been true for many years. That seems so unacceptable, cyber theft. But, and that is the opposite of openness, that's just duplicitous.
There's a word that's come up several times just in the remarks from everyone, and that is trust. And I think we had greater trust several years ago, mutually, between the United States and China. That trust is broken down, and we're entering a security dilemma where each, through the eyes of the other, appears as a threat. And that lack of trust, I think, is toxic to systems that are premised on openness, because you can only be open with someone that you do trust, for fear that they're going to use your openness against you. I don't know how we get back to that place where we do not perceive each other in those terms, but instead it seems to be deepening. And I think Xi Jinping, actually, if you read his writings, it was clear when he came to power, he sensed an existential threat to the party's power. He spent a lot of time talking and speaking about how the Soviet Union collapsed, how the Soviet Communist Party collapse, and how that was not going to happen under his watch. And there are ways in which you could explain everything that came after that through that lens. It's a little simplistic, but there's a truth to it fundamentally. And so I think the breakdown in trust is really, I think, what is causing the openness to unravel. Among our traditional allies and partners where we preserve that trust, the system is still functioning quite well. But it's countries, I think, you would disagree, it seems. But please.
Well, I think if President Biden hadn't made his remarks 2 days ago about Xi Jinping being a dictator, which has some truth to it, right? And just as it is true that this man identified data early on before other members of his party as a means of control, there's no doubt about that. But at the Blinken meeting, they agreed to all sorts of trust-building exercises, travel, joint stuff. And I forgive me for being Pollyanna, but I do think the United States very much recognizes that we need China, certainly on global warming, certainly on Ukraine. We have to keep the lines of communication open related to Taiwan. But I'm just wondering, with you guys who are China experts as opposed to me, how is it that one remark could almost be seen as derailing? Because both sides have an incentive to want the trust. Things could get worse in China soon financially.
Yeah, so I think going to that meetings, we're sort of straying from data here, but I hope people forgive that. If you like current events,
We're in Washington.
So the thing about those meetings was the first meeting was with Qin Gang, who's the new foreign minister, but then Blinken had Secretary Blinken had two other meetings. One is with Wang Yi, who's the party's former Minister of Foreign Affairs, and is now the foreign affairs sort of chief above Qin Gang, and then with Xi himself. And in those meetings, Secretary Blinken and delegation were basically told in uncompromising terms by Wang, who was kind of like the hatchet man, that the U.S. was going to have to stop all of this behavior that was detrimental to China's interests. Should stop. That was the message. The content of the meeting was for Wang to lecture the U.S. side about why everything they were doing vis-a-vis China was wrong. U.S. policy toward China was wrong. Now, he's a more authoritative source than his subordinate Qin, which I think actually means that levels of trust may be perhaps a bit lower than the dialogue between Secretary Blinken and Minister Qin would have indicated. With Xi, it was a somewhat, in terms of words, gentler, because, you know, she's playing a sort of benevolent autocrat role in that setting. He did, you know, sit at the head of the table and kind of preside over the meeting. At least that's what we know, according to photographs. And his message at the same time was also simply that the United States and China were going to have to get along. But that also meant the United States basically, again, doing nothing to harm China's interests. Now, the problem when you have a competition between, you know, two powerful countries, and, you know, the premise of that competition is that one of those countries should do nothing that could be construed as harming the other country's interests. I mean, then you don't really have a competition at all. And the message being sent by Beijing is that the U.S. shouldn't bother competing. Why? She keeps using this phrase about, you know, history and sort of new forces and the world being in a new era of history. And what he really means by that, I think you'll find an accurate description or, you know, kind of exegesis in his discussions with his dear friend, as he calls him, Vladimir Putin in Russia, where the two of them talk about together being the active agents of a change in like era, of a change in historical cycle. And this is Xi's vision, that China is on the right side of history, which is another phrase that China's diplomats frequently use. And by implication, the United States is on the wrong side of history. And so history I think it is somewhat about Marxist-Leninism. So, you know, like history in Marxist-Leninism being a kind of like inevitable and an inexorable force because it's shaped by, you know, deep material, it itself is shaped by deep material forces that just kind of like happen dialectic process. There's no controlling it, right? China's on the right side, the US is on the wrong side, and therefore the US has to simply acquiesce. That's Xi's message. It's not a message of trust at all. It's a message of get out of our way. And to the extent that that's not, you know, what is being interpreted in Washington, I think that's a strategic miscalculation.
So I want to turn to the audience now, because I think that's a really good, provocative, strong statement. Yes, please, right over here.
I'm a bureaucracy and intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. It's very clear that China, under Xi Jinping, will weaponize whatever it has in there. And then he talk of moderation, this mad. I think we sort of have to look at this problem as the war has begun. And so I want to ask, at the risk of building more hideous statements out and Kelly, is it time to eat that skin? Or is that tremendous?
I think an easy fix, not an easy fix, I shouldn't put it in those terms, but to your point at the end there, I think the idea that we'd move more in a direction in which like cloud storage services and data centers, you know, that support them are offshored, that's probably the wrong direction. And, you know, it was out in the New York Times even today, the Biden administration is looking more critically at Huawei and other Chinese cloud providers. And I think, you know, that's at least a very fair first step. Why not at least begin to mitigate or moderate, even though those are, you know, not necessarily appropriate, terms for the scale of the conflict, but why not at least take those as a starting point, that we need to not voluntarily offshore important information. That, I think I'm in agreement with you right there, that we need to take, we being, the U.S. federal government, state governments, others need to take a decisive step toward understanding where data goes, and understanding that there's a competition and making the right choices, which are probably not to continue to integrate our data infrastructure with the infrastructure of a competitor. And that's absolutely right.
Would others like to address the question?
Orville with Hoover Institution. Want to make a terminological appeal. Could we, instead of talking about China, say Xi Jinping's China as much as we possibly can? Number one. Number two, instead of saying Leninist, which means nothing to the average American, say fascist, which is what we're dealing with, it seems to me. And the third thing, instead of saying reshaping the international order, think about whether we would have described Napoleon as reshaping the international order. I think it's much too bland. And with respect to all of that, I haven't heard enough discussion, what I would like to hear, about a great asymmetry here, which is that Xi Jinping's China, I'm going to throw my own picture, has access to 1.4 billion captive data producers, and another, I guess, 3 or 4 billion in the non-developed world, whom they are rapidly infiltrating and collecting their data. And our feeble attempts to keep them out of our data sources is pretty feeble, I believe. So there's a huge asymmetry here where they control what they want to be used, and they also have access to what we, and I don't know, I'm not saying there's an obvious answer to that, but it seems to me if you're going to talk about competitive strategies, which is a common buzzword at the Pentagon, I would call them conflictual strategies, where it's something deeper than a competition. Isn't that asymmetry something awfully important? I'm sorry, I bloated it up too much.
Can I just address that? Hi, Paul. You're presuming that economies of scale and scope lead to competitiveness in data, right? The more data sources you have. There's no evidence of that. In fact, the opposite is true. What matters is the quality, completeness, accuracy of the data set. So one of the problems China has had, and I'm not even just talking AI, let me talk, it has tried to put to developing countries through Belt and Road some of its facial recognition technologies. And people say the reason China wants to make those sales is so that they can get lots of people of color into their data set. So they're feeling that they don't have completeness of data. Maybe they're trying, I wouldn't argue with that, but I think your presumption is wrong. And in fact, more and more, we are trying to do two things, and you know this because DARPA funded in 2014 and did not succeed, to effectively anonymize data. And number two, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, creating synthetic data sets. So a synthetic data set means that you take a data set of personal data related to, let's say, people you might want to extend credit to versus those you don't want to, and you remodel it to make it not actually it resembles, but it is not the same. And more firms are learning to use that because they're not good at protecting personal data. And also, you need to put the blame squarely here because we don't have a national data protection. So just to summarize, your presumption that economies of scale and scope yield you, go ahead.
I'm not saying that quantity is more important. Quality is more important. But they're getting our quality and their quantity.
How do you know that? Because, in this, while I agree with this, there is no evidence, just as the United States, and I understand this, did not present evidence as to why TikTok was a national security threat, based on the laws that China has that, that China requires firms to share data at times.
we need to see the evidence. I'd like to see the evidence that China is actually accumulating this data and analyzing.
To those points, I think we are, this is actually a moment in which the horse maybe has not fully bolted from the barn. And to the extent that AI cooperation with China is still on the agenda, I think there are very legitimate reasons to openly and transparently discuss whether that should, in fact, be the case. Because the other thing about these technologies, data included, is that we can't predict the future. We don't know where these technologies are going to go. It may be that data in volume and quantity does not have the same impact on technological advancement now, but it could well in the future. And so I think that there is, perhaps still a pretty good case to be made that, the amount being collected does matter. We just simply don't have all the answers right now because AI technology is new and data technology is new. We seem to be sleepwalking, though, into, almost like a new technological era in which we assume that all of the old rules apply. And I think that really merits some serious ethical and national security discussion. That's my personal, the risks are potentially great. Maybe I watched too many Terminator, but I think that that joking aside, AI is clearly very powerful. Its potential for misinformation is already clearly very powerful. Its potential for manipulating images, its potential for simulating human interactions, all incredibly powerful and are, I think, certainly going to have an impact on the next, several years. These aren't like medium term.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Eating that beast, again, with a competitor.
The United States, not the U.S. government, one of our biggest disputes with Europe is the collection of personal data by the U.S. government, right? So we have an agreement with the EU. Meanwhile, if you believe that U.S. companies practice surveillance capitalism, U.S. companies are, the biggest data collectors in the world. And this did not start with, Google's emergence. This started with banks in the 1930s, giving credit around the world. So this is not something that's new. And one thing I've often wondered, but no one knows this, who does have lots of the world's personal data? Like what firms do? I wonder sometimes, does Citibank have more? Because it's been, its precursors have been around than Google does. My gut is Google has more because it collects it in different ways through different products and services. But if you've been around for forever, serving the globe, MasterCard, another one, you have an awful lot of the world's data. And where do you store it? How do you use it? As Matt is saying, I agree, we need a discussion of that. My vision of it, I just want to reiterate though, is that I fear that what you're positing will mean less access to the world's data for the United States. Well, should give you.
We're here to business report. He knows well.
I use. I wish.
But because to me, I see data like children. I realize that sounds ridiculous, but I look at it, I take a Amartya Sen perspective. To me, it's what I see is potential. It's got potential to be used for business uses, and it's got potential to be used for public good purposes simultaneously. And that's why I think we need to really think as citizens about the role of data in society. But that discussion has not occurred here, and frankly, I haven't seen it really anywhere except for Germany. And even there, very few people actually participate in that discussion. But they talk about it as digital public goods, and they've written a data strategy for the economy and the polity, and that's interesting. They're trying to push it forward at the UN because, they understand that the more that you share data, including personal data that is protected and hopefully anonymized or made through a synthetic data set, the more opportunities you have to innovate and to learn.
I think we had some questions over here. I think, yeah, yes.
For Dr. Susan, because earlier you mentioned that you're not as much as an expert compared to the other panelists.
On China.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask, what motivated you to investigate China's approach to data accumulation and exploitation?
Because I am a consultant to the XR Association. That's thing one.
Okay.
So but since 2018, I run a think tank at GW that maps the governance of data around the world. So we look at what are the strategies, what are the laws and regulations, what are the structures that those governments put in place to address or to accommodate personal, proprietary, and public data. So for example, do they have a public data strategy? Like some nations actually say, you need to treat public data differently from data that is from Wikipedia that is widely available to the public but is not produced by the government. What of that public data should be secret and what of it what should be shared?
Susan, can I ask a corollary related to that? Because I think that's a really effective strategy for countries that are rule of law countries. But if you were to collect, say, constitutions around the world, you would be convinced that China had freedom of speech.
You make a good point.
And so, there's, I think, a sort of methodological issue for countries that are opaque and that also have profound rule of law issues that I think requires maybe an adaptation to that methodology when you're confronting nations that have different political and ideological systems. Just a thought.
Oh, but the way that researchers address that, though, is that we try to have counterparts in each country that, at least we do, examine our data sets and correct us if we got it wrong. I don't define China as opaque, right? I think it makes up statistics, and it is opaque in some areas, but I think a lot of it, as this report reveals, there's a lot of Chinese data that is open, right? It's just, it's certainly not it has different norms than the United States, but I hear you, and I think you're making a good point. And it is something to struggle with. Actually, the problem is more developing countries because they don't, it's much more important to them to, understandably, to address public health problems, not IPR systems.
Yes, please.
Thanks so much.
Grady.
No, I was just going to add on a small point. I was reporting on last week, there was a conference in Riyadh that I think BGI, Sense Time, and Huawei were all like major presenters at. And, in talking to sort of experts around the region, it's like these countries could partner with companies that, American companies, but like the standards, much more complicated contracts. Instead, you could partner with SenseTime to build out, so it's, how do American companies or, companies with better sort of data practice standards compete? And I don't know how to answer that question, but I think as these countries become more entrenched in the developing world and around the world, I think is it creating these two separate data spheres?
Well, I wrote a paper called Digital Realms, and, we had that hypothesis that there were three separate data spheres, but so the EU, China, and I would say everybody else, but that is no longer true. I think, honestly, the United States is unfortunately, because of our gridlock in Congress, we're nowhere been seen on these issues internationally. I hope that'll change. I spend a lot of time each day trying to make the change, but can't say I'm succeeding.
Thanks so much, everyone. This goes off of what Grady was saying, and forgive me, I'm not an academic, so I might have a much more specific question from the report. So I noted that data trading platforms as sort of sites of trade in data as a good, to your earlier point, are mentioned sort of once in the report, and then you allude as you talk about the cluster strategy that the CCP is using. to the fact that Huawei and other major companies in China that are telecoms companies are interested in partnering with the government on the creation of those centers. And so I track, I guess, the flow of data as a good throughout South and Southeast Asia and include China as well in as part of that, or just for the sake of this example. Obviously there are nuances and differences, but we see in South and Southeast Asia large growth of these kind of like data centers where you're mining data, and I'm talking about personal data as a good and trading it. So I'm interested, because I don't know that much about that practice inside China specifically, like how that integrates within what the CCP is already kind of like outlined, and what the potential is of that type of mining of data internally. Is Huawei going to be mining from South and Southeast Asia data that's produced there and incorporating that within China? Is that going to be mostly Chinese nationalized data? And sort of, I guess a little bit more than the bullet in the report, although it was very useful. Yes,
Sure. Great question. On the is Huawei mining, I think the evidence probably tilts in the direction of there are certainly examples of China's telecoms players seemingly playing a role in like intelligence collection. And I think more broadly, I think you could look at China's infrastructural expansion as an extension of the policies that I talk about in this paper as well. In other words, it wouldn't necessarily, be just through like clandestine activity, but also like setting up partnerships with other research institutions like Huawei, Alibaba. Others are big players in Malaysia, for example. That creates more of these opportunities to shape the data environment, and how China uses those abilities. Again, I can't give you like the definitive answer right there because it's very contextual, but I think from a technical perspective and from a strategic perspective, the potential is definitely there. To your first question, which is about these like data exchanges, the past couple of years, local governments started setting up, this is sort of one of the ways in which policy cascades, started setting up exchanges that were meant to, kind of like build off of directives from the top level of the government saying that data is a commodity, data should be treated as a commodity, and data should be flowing more freely between different entities within China. I read a lot of that as just another way of saying that we want to make sure we know where the data is, we know what it is. So like part of these efforts also was that they catalog data as well. So it's not just like a trading platform, but it's also almost like a registry is the idea. These are still being piloted. I don't think they exist everywhere, but at the same time, those fit the pattern. I think they fit the fact pattern pretty well. They are additional nodes through which ultimately government entities have full view of the data resources that exist at their disposal.
Did you want to address the question?
We have just a few minutes left, so yes, right over here. Thank you.
Thank you all once again. I'm just a little bit curious as to how this sort of data capture by Xi Jinping's China ties into its network of proxies, whether we're talking about some potential collaboration with Russia, Iran, other threats to the United States around the world. Is there a sense in which this data capture can lead to transmission and can lead to, you spoke about leverage that is extended to China's proxy network? And do you see that as viable, as anything we have any sort of evidence for? And if not, what is the likelihood of that sort of transmission and that sort of relationship?
So I think on Russia, that is the $1 million question, or at least it would be a serious indicator of like integration between those two countries if we were seeing even freer exchange information resources. I only work with open source material, so I think that may be another kind of like challenge to answering that question with any degree of precision. What we do know is, Xi's China's defense minister's visit to Moscow. This is in March or April. Readouts basically indicated that the two countries had agreed to step up their military cooperation. And so what that means for information exchange and other integration is a hard question to answer. But the proposal was that it increase. In terms of other instances of cooperation, I think actually the Middle East is a really interesting one, and a lot of different and very sensitive trajectories there. But Chinese companies, data-rich Chinese companies, are working with sort of kind of interesting hybrid entities like G42 to create new sort of like platforms for sharing and using ostensibly for commercial purposes data. And I think those are worth looking into more seriously. It sounds like people are beginning to ask these questions, but yeah, I mean, the strategies have actually, earlier point, been around for a long time, but they are going global. They're supercharged by newer forms of technology, and the players involved, now are definitely more than just China. China and Russia would be a potent combination. Goes without saying, and that frankly seems to be where the direction is going.
I want to thank the panelists, Matt, for a really rich discussion. It's always good when we have, a little bit of friction and sparks fly up, because if everyone agrees, then clearly we haven't thought of something. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. We're going to have a little reception afterwards with some wine, cheese, and we hope the conversation will continue. So, again, thanks.